The donor. It started innocently enough. I was desperate for a kidney donor for my brother, Alex. He was deteriorating fast, and the waiting list was painfully long. In a moment of desperation, I turned to Craigslist. I posted a heartfelt plea, hoping for a miracle. Little did I know, I was opening the door to something far more sinister. A week after posting the ad, I received an email from someone named Dr. Harold Grant. He claimed to be able to arrange a donor quickly, for a price. The message was brief and direct, lacking any empathy, but the offer was tempting. With Alex's condition worsening, I felt I had no choice but to reply. Dr. Grant suggested we meet in person. We arranged to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. He was a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me. He spoke in a calm, almost hypnotic voice, assuring me that he could help Alex, but the process was unconventional. I was too desperate to question his methods. Despite my reservations, I agreed to his terms. We signed a contract, and I paid a hefty fee up front. Dr. Grant assured me that the donor would be found within a week. As I left the cafe, a chill ran down my spine. Something about the whole arrangement felt wrong, but I pushed the feeling aside. Alex's life was at stake. True to his word, Dr. Grant called me 3 days later. He had found a donor. The surgery was scheduled for the next day. I was overwhelmed with relief and fear. The speed and secrecy of it all were unsettling, but I didn't see any other option. I informed Alex, who was too weak to question the details, and we prepared for the procedure. The surgery took place in a small, private clinic. The building was old and seemed abandoned. The inside was cold and sterile, with an eerie silence hanging in the air. Dr. Grant and his team were efficient and professional, but their lack of warmth was unsettling. I waited anxiously, pacing the dimly lit hallway, until Dr. Grant emerged, saying the surgery was a success. Alex's recovery was slow but steady. However, he began to experience strange symptoms, vivid nightmares, hallucinations, and a constant feeling of being watched. I tried to reassure him, attributing it to post-surgical stress, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The nightmares he described were disturbingly detailed and filled with images of dark, twisted places. Soon, it wasn't just Alex who experienced the strange occurrences. Objects moved on their own, and shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of my vision. One night, I woke to find Alex standing by my bed, eyes vacant, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. When I shook him, he snapped out of it, confused and scared. Determined to find answers, I began researching Dr. Grant. What I found was chilling. He had been implicated in several missing person cases but had never been charged. There were rumors of illegal organ trafficking and connections to occult practices. The deeper I delved, the more convinced I became that we were dealing with something far darker than we had imagined. I confronted Dr. Grant, demanding to know the truth. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the empty clinic. He admitted that the donors were not willing participants. The organs were taken from people who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. He claimed that the transplant had created a link between Alex and the restless spirits of the donors. Realizing the danger we were in, I decided to take Alex and leave town. As we packed, the paranormal activity intensified. The shadows grew darker and more defined, and the whispers became louder, almost deafening. It felt as if the spirits were trying to prevent us from leaving. We managed to escape, but the sense of being followed never left us. We found refuge in a small, isolated cabin owned by an old family friend. The place was secluded, surrounded by dense woods. For a while, it seemed like we had outrun the horrors. But soon, Alex's symptoms worsened. He began to speak in voices that were not his own, and his eyes would glaze over, filled with a cold, otherworldly emptiness. In desperation, I contacted a medium named Clara, who had a reputation for dealing with the supernatural. She agreed to help and arrived at the cabin with an array of strange tools and artifacts. Clara conducted a seance, attempting to communicate with the spirits haunting Alex. The air grew thick, and the temperature plummeted as she chanted. During the seance, the spirits revealed themselves. They were the souls of the people who had been murdered for their organs. They were trapped, unable to move on because of the violent way they had died. They demanded justice, and their anger was directed at anyone connected to their deaths. Clara warned that unless the spirits were appeased, they would consume Alex entirely. Clara suggested finding the graves of the donors and giving them a proper burial. The idea seemed daunting, but it was our only hope. We began the grim task of locating the victims, guided by Clara's abilities. Each discovery was a somber reminder of the horrors that had been inflicted upon them. As we performed the burials, the hauntings grew more violent. It was as if the spirits were fighting back, unwilling to leave without exacting their revenge. Dr. Grant appeared one night, furious that we were interfering with his plans. He revealed that he had been using dark rituals to bind the spirits, harnessing their power for his own gain. A fierce confrontation ensued. Dr. Grant summoned the spirits to attack us, but Clara countered with her own rituals. The cabin became a battleground of supernatural forces. The walls shook, and an unearthly wail filled the air. In the midst of the chaos, Alex fell to the ground, convulsing violently. Clara revealed that to break the curse, a sacrifice was needed, someone who willingly gave their life to save the others. Without hesitation, she offered herself. She believed it was her duty to protect the living from the malevolent spirits. As she performed the final ritual, the spirits swirled around her, their anger palpable. Clara's sacrifice worked. The spirits began to dissipate, and their rage quelled. The air cleared, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Alex's convulsions stopped, and he regained consciousness, his eyes clear and free of the haunting presence. The cabin, once filled with fear and darkness, now felt calm and peaceful. With the spirits at rest, Alex and I returned home. The experience changed us both profoundly. We vowed to honor Clara's memory and the victims by speaking out against illegal organ trafficking and raising awareness. The old shortwave radio, once a symbol of hope, now stood as a reminder of the darkness we had faced. We never forgot the haunting, but we found solace in knowing we had helped bring peace to the tormented souls. The harvest. It started with an ad on Craigslist. I was scrolling through the listings late one night, looking for a cheap second-hand bike, when I stumbled upon it. Organ donors needed generous compensation. I was strapped for cash, and it seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I clicked the ad. The next day, I received an email inviting me to an interview. The address was an old, run-down office building on the edge of town. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile and cold. I met Dr. Gray, a tall, thin man with piercing blue eyes. He asked a few questions about my health and financial situation, and then handed me a contract. The money was too good to pass up, so I signed without hesitation. A week later, I was in a dimly lit operating room. Dr. Gray assured me that the procedure would be painless and that I would be under anesthesia the entire time. I lay down on the table, and the nurse placed a mask over my face. The last thing I saw before I drifted off was the cold, clinical light above me. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. I had no memory of how I got there. My side ached, and there was a bandage over a small incision. Beside me was an envelope filled with cash. I felt a sense of unease but tried to push it aside. The money was real, and my financial problems were solved. That night, I had my first nightmare. I was in a dark room, surrounded by shadowy figures. They were whispering, their voices filled with malice. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. Over the next few days, the nightmares became more frequent and more vivid. The nightmares soon followed me into the waking world. I began to hear whispers, just on the edge of my hearing. They were faint at first, but they grew louder with each passing day. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. I felt like I was being watched. One morning, I woke up to find strange markings on my body. They were faint, almost like bruises, but in intricate patterns. I had no memory of how they got there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I began to feel a presence in my apartment, something watching me from the shadows. Desperate for answers, I started researching online. I found stories of other people who had responded to similar ads. They all reported similar experiences, nightmares, voices, strange markings. Some had disappeared without a trace. The deeper I dug, the more terrified I became. I went back to the office building, but it was abandoned. The door was locked, and the windows boarded up. It was as if no one had ever been there. I contacted the email address, but it bounced back. I was on my own, with no way to find Dr. Gray or anyone who might have answers. One night, the presence in my apartment became tangible. I saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was humanoid, but its features were indistinct, like a silhouette. It didn't move, just watched me. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. When it finally vanished, I was left shaking and drenched in sweat. I found an online forum for people who have experienced paranormal activities. I posted my story, and to my surprise, several people responded with similar experiences. We formed a small group, sharing our stories and trying to piece together what was happening. One member, Jane, had a lead on where we might find Dr. Gray. Jane and I met up and decided to investigate together. We followed a series of leads to an old mansion on the outskirts of town. It was dilapidated and overgrown with weeds. We broke in and began to explore. The air was thick with a sense of malevolence, and we heard whispers echoing through the halls. In the basement, we found a hidden lab. It was filled with medical equipment, jars of strange substances, and folders of notes. The notes detailed experiments on human subjects, attempting to harness paranormal energy through organ transplants. We realized that the organs we had donated were being used to fuel these experiments. As we read through the notes, the temperature dropped, and the whispers grew louder. The shadowy figure appeared again, this time accompanied by others. They moved closer, their forms becoming more distinct. We fled the mansion, but the figures followed, their presence clinging to us like a dark cloud. Back at Jane's apartment, we pieced together the information we had found. Dr. Gray was trying to create a bridge between the living and the dead, using the organs of the living as conduits for spirits. The figures we were seeing were the spirits of those whose organs had been taken, trapped between worlds and seeking revenge. We decided to confront Dr. Gray and put an end to his experiments. Through our online group, we gathered a small team of people who had been affected. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find and returned to the mansion. The air was thick with tension as we prepared for the final confrontation. We found Dr. Gray in the lab, surrounded by his equipment. He seemed unsurprised to see us, as if he had been expecting this moment. He explained his experiments with a chilling calmness, claiming he was on the verge of a breakthrough. The shadowy figures surrounded us, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. We attacked Dr. Gray, destroying his equipment and the jars containing the strange substances. The shadowy figures seemed to gain strength, their forms becoming more solid. Dr. Gray fought back, but we overpowered him. As we destroyed the last of his equipment, the figures turned on him, dragging him into the shadows. With Dr. Gray gone and his lab destroyed, the figures began to dissipate. The whispers faded, and the temperature returned to normal. The sense of malevolence lifted, replaced by a feeling of peace. We had freed the trapped spirits, allowing them to move on to the afterlife. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The nightmares ceased, and the strange markings disappeared. I kept in touch with Jane and the others, forming a bond through our shared experience. We knew we had been lucky to survive, and we were determined to help others avoid falling into the same trap. The Craigslist ad was gone, but the memory of those harrowing days stayed with us, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of everyday life. The Haunted. It all started with a Craigslist ad. I was scrolling through the community section when I stumbled upon it. Urgent, organ donors needed. Generous compensation. The ad seemed too good to be true, but I was in a tight spot financially. I figured it wouldn't hurt to check it out. The next day, I met with Dr. Evan Peterson at a nondescript office building. He seemed professional and reassuring, explaining that they were conducting research on organ transplants and needed healthy donors. The compensation he offered was substantial, enough to ease my financial burdens. I agreed to the procedure, scheduled for the following week. The hospital where the procedure took place was eerily quiet. Dr. Peterson and his team were efficient, and before I knew it, I was being prepped for surgery. The anesthesia took hold, and everything went dark. I woke up hours later in a recovery room, feeling groggy but otherwise fine. They had taken a kidney, and I was assured it had gone to someone in desperate need. A few days after the procedure, I started experiencing strange symptoms. It began with vivid nightmares of people screaming and shadows lurking in the corners of my vision. I chalked it up to post-surgery stress, but the symptoms only got worse. My body ached, and a cold, oppressive feeling settled over me. One night, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was faint and distorted, almost as if it were coming from a great distance. "You took something that wasn't yours," it said. "Return what you've stolen, or suffer the consequences." The line went dead, leaving me shaken and terrified. Desperate for answers, I started researching Dr. Peterson and his practice. I discovered that several other donors had reported similar experiences, nightmares, hallucinations, and strange phone calls. Worse, some of them had disappeared without a trace. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that something sinister was at play. One night, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and her skin pale. She pointed at me and whispered, "Give it back." I bolted upright, but she vanished before I could react. The encounter left me trembling, convinced that I was being haunted by the ghost of someone who had died because of my organ donation. I confronted Dr. Peterson about my experiences, but he dismissed my concerns, insisting that everything was perfectly normal. His calm demeanor only made me more suspicious. As I left his office, I noticed a woman staring at me intently. She introduced herself as Lisa and claimed to be another former donor. She had experienced the same haunting symptoms and was determined to find out the truth. Lisa and I decided to work together to uncover what was happening. We tracked down other donors, all of whom had similar stories of ghostly apparitions and terrifying phone calls. It became clear that we were dealing with something far beyond the natural world. Through our investigation, we discovered that Dr. Peterson's clinic was built on the site of an old hospital that had burned down decades ago. Many patients had died in the fire, and their spirits were said to haunt the area. We realized that the organs we had donated were somehow connected to these restless spirits, binding us to their unfinished business. Lisa suggested holding a seance to communicate with the spirits directly. We gathered in her apartment, lighting candles and forming a circle. As we called out to the spirits, the temperature dropped, and a heavy silence filled the room. Suddenly, we were surrounded by ghostly figures, their faces twisted in anguish. One of them, a woman, stepped forward and spoke. "You must make amends. Only then will we find peace." Haunted by guilt, I visited the graves of those who had died in the fire. I apologized to each of them, explaining that I hadn't known the true cost of my actions. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, and the oppressive feeling began to fade. Lisa and I decided to help the other donors do the same. Dr. Peterson was not pleased with our efforts to make amends. He confronted us, revealing his true nature. He had been using the donated organs to conduct dark experiments, trying to harness the power of the restless spirits. He threatened to make our lives a living hell if we continued to interfere. Fearful for our safety, Lisa and I decided to leave town. We packed our bags and hit the road, hoping to stay ahead of Dr. Peterson. But no matter where we went, the hauntings continued. The spirits were relentless, their anguish driving them to seek revenge. While on the run, we broke into Dr. Peterson's office, hoping to find evidence of his experiments. We uncovered a hidden room filled with files detailing his gruesome work. He had been conducting rituals, using the organs to bind the spirits to our bodies, hoping to control them. We took the files, determined to expose his atrocities. As we pored over the files, we discovered that Dr. Peterson had a partner, a wealthy benefactor who funded his experiments in exchange for the promise of immortality. The benefactor had been using the organs to prolong his own life, at the expense of countless innocent souls. Armed with this knowledge, Lisa and I confronted the benefactor. He was a frail old man, living in a mansion filled with stolen artifacts. When we presented our evidence, he laughed, revealing that he had no intention of stopping. He had lived for centuries, and he would continue to do so, no matter the cost. In a desperate bid to end the hauntings, Lisa and I performed a ritual we found in Dr. Peterson's files. We gathered the remaining donors and conducted the ceremony, hoping to sever the connection between the spirits and our bodies. As we chanted, the room filled with an otherworldly light, and the spirits appeared, their faces filled with hope. Dr. Peterson and his benefactor interrupted the ritual, determined to stop us. A fierce struggle ensued, with the spirits lending us their strength. In the chaos, the benefactor was killed, his body crumbling to dust. Dr. Peterson fled, but not before vowing to return. With the benefactor dead and the ritual complete, the spirits finally found peace. The haunting ceased, and the oppressive feeling lifted. Lisa and I returned home, forever changed by our ordeal. We made it our mission to help others who had been affected by Dr. Peterson's experiments, determined to ensure that no one else would suffer as we had. The Craigslist ad that had started it all was long gone, but the memories of those dark days would haunt us forever.